Hi, everybody. Is the mic working? Can you hear us in the back? Marianne Hirsch and I are two of the organizers of this event, and we'd like to welcome you all to it and to say just a word about how it came to be happening. A few years ago, President Bollinger, the president of Columbia University, came to Marianne and asked if our working group, the Center for the Study of Social Difference, would take on some global projects that focused on women. His idea was that Columbia's global centers, which are located all over the world, should have programming that really focused on women. And so we created an initiative called Women Creating Change. It has many parts. This workshop is one of them. This one, however, is about memory. And Marianne's going to say just a word about this particular working group and workshop.
So we're really happy to be here in Istanbul and to be working with the Columbia Global Center, who have been wonderful hosts and organizers for us. And we also want to thank Depo Gallery for initiating and carrying out this absolutely beautiful and stunning exhibition that helps us to think about mobilizing memory for change and for the future. Can you hear me? No. Let me just stick with this one. So our work comprises many parts. We're bringing together artists, academics, scholars, students, trying to think about how some of the crimes of the past can be activated and mobilized for an alternative future. And we look at that in social sciences, in humanities, but also through the arts. Today, we're really fortunate to be here with a number of scholars and colleagues from Istanbul to enlarge the conversation and to hear a number of different perspectives that are local. Because even though we're trying to carry out a project that started out in Santiago, that brought us to Istanbul, that we hope to move to Rio and Paris and New York, the local is always at the center of the global, and we really need to be focusing on local problems as well as on how those local problems can speak to each other and be brought into dialogue across borders and across differences. I don't want to take any more time, but I'm very happy to be here, and I'd like to welcome you to this day of roundtables.
So we have four distinguished in this panel on creating alternative archives. Each speaker will have 10 minutes, then I will open the floor to discussion. The first speaker is Leyla Neyzi. She's an anthropologist and an oral historian, teaches at Sabancı University. Her research interests include minorities, nationalism, memory, and youth culture in Turkey. Most recently, she completed a multimedia project, which she's going to present us today, on Kurdish and Turkish youth in Turkey and Germany. Yeah, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much. It's great to be here, to see familiar faces and meet new ones. As we have so little time, I will jump right in to talk about a very concrete recent project. The project is entitled Young People Speak Out, the Contribution of Oral History to Facing the Past, Reconciliation and Democratization in Turkey. The project was created between 2011 and 2013, and we continue to work on the products of this research. Some brief points about why this project. This project focused on oral history narratives of young Kurdish and Turkish people. And the idea in doing the project was, at the time and still, I think the biggest issue facing Turkey is the Kurdish issue, both in itself and in the fact that it's directly linked to issues of rights and democratization in Turkey. And The idea of working with youth and oral history was based on the fact that as oral history became popular in Turkey, it was identified very much with historical events, particularly recent history. That is, in a way, it was seen as sort of the other side of official history, which, of course, is very important. But in this project, I wanted to focus also on intergenerational transmission, post-memory, and constructions of time and history in the present by young people. I also felt that the present conflict in Turkey could be better understood through comparison. That is, rather than working in Kurdistan alone, I wanted to compare young people in Turkey's Kurdistan, in Western Turkey, as well as in the city of Berlin. So it was in these three different locations that we worked. Another important part of the project for us was the process. That is, we involved the young people we interviewed in the interview process. So young people themselves interviewed one another, took part in workshops, and were part of the output, the product output, and took part in the exhibition as well. By the end of the project, we created an archive of life history interviews. 200 interviews in video. We interviewed 100 young people between the ages of 15 and 30 in Diyarbakir, in Kurdistan, in Muğla, in Western Turkey, and in the city of Berlin. And out of this archive, 20 of these interviews you can actually find in edited version on our website. Which I will hopefully have a few minutes to show you. We also made a film about the project, which you can view on the website. The website is in 3 languages, Kurdish, Turkish, and English. In addition to the website and the film, we had an exhibition in Istanbul in a very interesting space called the Old Matzo Factory in Galata. It was a multimedia exhibition, and I'll show you some photos. And we produced also a book for a general audience in Turkey, which includes photographs. So basically, the point of the project was to reach a general audience in Turkey through multimedia. The more academic angle is forthcoming in articles in English in journals. So that's sort of kind of the balance. Okay, so before if I have time, I'll say a few things about the most important results of the project. But I want to show you very quickly a little bit about the website. This is the Kurdish website. You can also view it in English. And I can show you just a few photographs from the exhibition. So it was a multimedia exhibition using videos and photographs, but most importantly, we based the exhibition on quotations from the interviews. So it was also very textually oriented. Now, on the website, you can find 21 individuals, and for each individual, you can watch with English subtitles the edited parts of the interviews, and you can also see a transcript. So maybe I'll just play 1 minute of one interview, if possible. Ses.
Komşu çocuklarıyla falan. Güzel. Ya bahçemiz vardı. Hemen evin önünde küçük bir bahçe. Orada hep oynardık arkadaşlarla. Komşu çocuklarıyla falan. Güzel hayvanlarla falan. Güzel. Diyarbakır'ı az tanıyorum. Mesela birkaç kere ninem bizi mesela Diyarbakır'a falan götürünce bize bize eşya falan alınca veya bir kebap falan yemeye giderdik. Öyle yani. Öyle tanıyorum. Hayatım böyle Kürtçe konuştum yani. Okula gidince Türkçe konuştum. Ama hep Kürtçe konuştum. Babam buraya iltica etti. Yani Kürt olduğu için yani birkaç sorun olduğu için yani o Kürt olduğunu hep göstermek istediği için ve Türk olmadığını da göstermek için polislerle hep sorun çıktığı için hapishane falan çok şeyler oldu. Onun için en sonunda 10-15 sene diyeyim hapiste kalmamak için hemen yani buraya gel. Berlin'e geldim. Ben 1 yaşındaydım. Yani babam Türkiye'deydi de bizimle değildi artık. Yani o yavaş yavaş Avrupa tarafına gittiği için.
2 dakika. Tamam.
1 yaşındaydım. Sonra onu yine 9,5-10 yaşındayken gördüm. Yani çok iyi tanımıyordum. Yeni birisiyle tanıştım. Bazen
Okay, so I have 2 minutes. Just one sentence on the findings of the project. We could say that there was a real question of non-encounters. That's the word that we used between the young Turkish and Kurdish people that we talked to. And to put it in a nutshell, we felt that this had a lot to do with very different conceptions of time and history between these two populations. As the Kurdish young people were born into war, for them, time and history had a very significant determining power in their lives, and they defined themselves as victims of violence, which for them was actually a form of empowerment, actually. And they were actually acting as oral historians, performing their life narratives, which was the complete contrast with the Turkish young people who were living in the present and for the future, and whose narratives were very fragmentary, and who were not really interested in either their personal or collective histories in the same intimate way. So that's as much as I can say in the time allotted to me. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Leyla. Time is very short. Sorry for that. Actually, this project shows how the collection process itself is important in creating alternative archives, and also the presentation of the output. I suggest you to go to the website and click various menus. I did it several times. It is really a great website, great research. So the second speaker is Özlem Kaya. She's a PhD candidate at Boğaziçi University, and she has been working with the Truth, Justice, Memory Center memory program since 2012. She's among the writers of the Unspoken Truth and Forced Disappearances and Holding Up the Photograph Experiences of Women whose husbands were forcibly disappeared, which is she's going to present us. Yes, Özlem.
Teşekkürler. Ben Türkçe sunum yapacağım. Onun için 1-2 dakika bekleyeyim. İsterseniz. Öncelikle sunma bilmeyenleriniz için hafıza merkezine dair bir iki cümleyle, sonra fotoğrafı kaldırmak adlı adı altına raporlaştırdığımız çalışmayla ve bu sergi kapsamında ikinci katta gösterilen yine raporla aynı adı taşıyan videonun bizim için ne anlama geldiğini anlatacağım, birkaç şeyle bitireceğim. Hafıza Merkezi İstanbul merkezli bir insan hakları kuruluşu, amacı geçmişte yaşanan ağır insan hakları ihlalleriyle ilgili hakikatleri açığa çıkarmaya katkıda bulunmak ve böylelikle de kolektif hafızanın oluşmasına katkı sunmak. Aynı zamanda da bu insan hakları ihlallerine uğrayan kişilerin adalet arayışında onları desteklemek. Biz bu anlamda çalışmaya başladığımızda ilk anda somut bir insan hakkı ihlalinden yola çıktık ve zorla kaybetmeleri çalışma alanı olarak belirledik. Bu yönde yaptığımız çalışmaları da raporlaştırıyoruz. Ayrıca bir online veri tabanında sunuyoruz. Geçen sene çalışmanın kapsamında da eşi zorla kaybedilen kadınlarla görüşmeler yaptık. Burada amaç biraz daha zorla kaybetmelere toplumsal cinsiyet perspektifiyle yaklaşmaktı. Bu ne demek? Ve neden gerekiyor aslında? Şundan, kaybetmeler bir bütünselliği içinde anlaşılabilir ve aslında geride kalanlar üzerindeki etkisi üzerinden anlaşılabilir. Bütünselliği derken hangi mekanizmalar altında uygulandığı bir yandan ve geride kalanların üzerindeki etkiler dediğimde erkek egemen sistem nedeniyle aslında kadın ve erkekler üzerinde farklı etkiler yaratan bir etkisi var. Bir yanıyla da bu hafıza üzerine konuşurken biz hafızanın parçalılığından, sürekliliğinden, kadın ve erkeklerin onun ne şekilde farklı aktardığından bahsediyoruz. Ama bir yandan da bunun bir sorumluluk getirdiğini, yani hatırlamaya ve hafızaya dair hatırladıklarımızın aslında bugüne ve yarına dair bir takım politik önerileri geliştirmeye ve uygulamaya yönelik de bir sorumluluk getirdiğini düşündüğümüzde bu uygulanacak politik önerileri de aslında bu geride kalanların farklılaşan deneyimlerinden ve taleplerinden çıkacak. Bu da kadın ve erkekler için yine farklı. Bu amaçla biz Diyarbakır, Silopi, Cizre, İdil, Uludere, Güçlükanak ve Şırnak merkezde görüşmeler yaptık. Bu görüşmelerden sonra da dediğim gibi raporu hazırladık ve yani ben aslında rapora dair birkaç bir şey söylemek istiyorum. Umarım zamanımı aşmam videoya yine de geçmeden önce. Şimdi bizim gördüğümüz görüşmelerde, yani kadınlarla yaptığımız görüşmeden sonra gördüğümüz şuydu. Örneğin en aktif olarak kaybı arayan kadınlar. Ama bir yandan da bu bütünselliği içinde dediğimiz gibi baktığımızda kaybetmeleri aslında belli bir devlet politikasının bir ayağı olarak uygulanmış ve Kürtlere yönelik ağırlıklı olarak uygulanmış. Onun için bu savaş politikalarının da farklı etkilerini hayatlarında yaşıyorlar. Ve yani örneğin eşleri kaybedilirken çocukları gerillada ölebiliyor, köyler yıkılıyor, göç ettiriliyorlar. Kendileri devletin erkek şiddetinin bin bir türüyle karşılaşıyorlar. Yine kaybetme belirsizlik demek. O anlamıyla da ölümden farklı aslında ve bunun farklı etkileri var. Çok somut bir etki örneğin kadınların sosyal hakları ailelerindeki erkekler üzerinden tanımlandığı için yine erkek egemen sistem nedeniyle aslında bu eşlerinin, babalarının örneğin öldüğü durumda normalde hakları kullanabilecekleri bir takım sosyal hak ve yardımlardan yararlanamıyorlar. Yine bu da mesela şöyle bir sonuç doğurmak zorunda kalıyor bir kısmı için. Kadınların ölümünü verdik dedikleri bir durum. O da bazıları için gayiplik kararı, bazıları için de ölüm ilanı vermek demek. Ve bu aslında maddi zorluklar nedeniyle bu bilinemeyen arada derede konumu bir tanımlı konuma çevirmek zorunda kalıyorlar kadınların kendileri. Yani eşlerine aslında öldü demek zorunda kalıyorlar ki o yardımlardan yararlanabilsinler. Bu onların üzerinde tabii ki de çok büyük yani başka türlü bir psikolojik yük de demek aslında. Yine eğer kaybedilen erkek evin geçimini sağlayansa ekonomik yükü çok ağır. Çalışıyorlarsa 2 kat çalışmak zorunda kalıyorlar ama bulabildikleri işler çok sınırlı. Bir yandan aslında bu ev içi emeklerini de örneğin etkiliyor. Videoda da kullandığımız bir alıntı, yaptığımız bir görüşmeden kadın gözleri dolarak evin tavanını kendi başına yapmak zorunda kaldığını anlatıyordu. Yani aslında yine onların tanımıyla hem kadın hem erkek oluyorlar. Ama bu hem kadın hem erkek olmak onları toplumsal cinsiyet rollerinden tamamen sıyıran bir şey değil. Bir yandan da yani onları kadınları rahatlatan bir şey değil. Aksine omuzlarındaki yükü arttırıyor. Ama bir yandan da yine başlarını kimseye eğmeden, yine bunlar kadınların kendi kullandıkları ifadeler, kendi başlarına ayakta kalmış olmanın gururunu ve gücünü de anlatıyorlar. Bu belirsizliğe dair son bir şey daha. Yine bu kadın olarak hepimizin toplumsal konumları çevremizdeki ve ailemizdeki erkekler üzerinden çokça tanımlanabiliyor. Evliyiz, kız çocuğuz, yani eşiz, karıyız, kız çocuğuz, anneyiz. Bu kadınlar ama aslında bu toplumsal konumlandırmalarla her günde mücadele ediyoruz ve bunun sınırlarını esnetmeye çalışıyoruz. Ama bu örneğin eşi kaybedilen kadınların durumu, yani o kadınlar ne dullar, ne boşanmışlar, ne hala evliler. Onun için aslında bir yanıyla da mücadele edebilecekleri ve sınırlarını esnetebilecekleri o hak ellerinden alınıyor. Şimdi ben videoya geçmek istiyorum bir yandan zamanı kontrol ederek. Şimdi bu görüşmelerden en son fotoğrafı kaldırmanın nereden geldiğini de anlatayım. Söyledikten sonra geçeyim. Bu aslında kadınların yine cumartesi anneleri eylemleriyle ilgili kendi söyledikleri bir tanımlamaydı. Cumartesileri gidip orada fotoğraf kaldırıyorlar ve orada adalet arıyorlar hala. Kadınlar Diyarbakır'da, İstanbul'da, Cizre'de, Yüksekova'da ve Batman'da her cumartesi gidip fotoğraflarını kaldırıyorlar. Yukarıdaki video ki umarım zamanınız olur ve izleyebilirsiniz. Bunun bu sergi kapsamında sergilenmesinin bizim için ne önemi vardı? Öncelikle hafızayı harekete geçirmek, bir yandan da geçmişle hesaplaşma sorumluluğu da demek. Bu da farklı türden hakikati ortaya koyma yöntemlerini içermeli. Yani raporlamalar dışında bu şekilde de biz bu dinlediklerimizi bir yanıyla da yaygınlaştırmak ve paylaşmak istedik. Bu aynı zamanda da bir tür sorumluluk aslında. Çünkü görüştüğümüz kadınlar bizden bunu istiyorlardı. Gidin ve bizim ulaşamadığımız yerlerde bunları anlatın. Şimdi bu videoda 2 temel nokta var bizim için. Birincisi daha önce söylemeye çalıştığım gibi aslında kadınların tarihsel bilginin öznesi olarak saymak ve onların bilgisine başvurmak, onlara gidip kaybetmeyi anlattırmak ve kaybetmeden sonra ne yaşadıklarını anlattırmak çok önemli ve onların nasıl aslında anlattıklarını görüyoruz videoda da. En küçük detayıyla işte o gün eşinin cebinde kaç para olduğundan eve onu almaya gelen jandarmanın üzerindeki kıyafetlere birçok detayı hatırlıyorlar. Bunu kadınlardan bu anlamda dinlemek dediğim gibi çok önemli. Ama ikinci nokta, o da şu, bizim daha öncelik verdiğimiz nokta, kaybetmeyi ve nasıl kaybedildiğini değil de kadınların kendi hayatını sormak, anlattırmak ve videoda da bir yanıyla ona daha fazla zaman vermeye çalıştık. Çünkü kadınlar orada da görüyoruz zaten çalışmak zorunda kalmışlar. Çocuklarından babalarının kaybedildiğini saklamak zorunda kalmışlar. Bilmedikleri bir dilde dertlerini anlatmak zorunda kalmışlar. Sadece kendi eşleri için değil, aynı tarihi yaşadıkları bir halk için sokağa çıkmışlar. Son bir şey söyleyerek bitireyim. Şimdi bu video aslında kadınların dediğim gibi bu deneyimini öne çıkaran bir video. Bu anlamıyla belki bizim de kurgumuz. Yani biz bunu öne çıkartarak verdik. Ama bir yanıyla da değil. Çünkü Biz zaten aslında bu çalışmaya başlarken kadınların deneyimlerini öne çıkarmak öncelikli bir irade ve bir yöntemler üzerine düşünmeyi de gerektirdiği için bu yöntemler üzerine de çokça düşünmüştük. Nasıl kadınları kendi deneyimleri üzerine konuşturabiliriz? İşte kaybedilmeyle bağlantılı kadın deneyimleri nelerdir? Nasıl sormamız gerekir? Örneğin Kürtçe görüşme yapmanın kendisi aramızdaki dil farkını engelleyen bir şey midir? Kadın hakikatleri denince ilk akla gelenlerin yanında daha incelikli olanlara nasıl ulaşabiliriz? Bu yöntemler üzerine uzunca süre kafa yorduk. Ancak şunu unutmamak gerekiyor. Videoda da yine var. Bu kadın diyor ki, görüşme yaptığımız bir kadın, kadınlar artık ne kadar güzel konuşuyorlar, ne kadar akıllı olmuşlar. Önceden öyle miydi? Bu aslında şunu gösteriyor. Bugün kadınlar olarak belki birçoğumuz çok daha farklı konulardan konuşuyoruz. Çünkü burada Kürt hareketinin, feminist hareketin, insan hakları mücadelesinin bizi taşıdığı ve kendimizi, kendi hayatımızı, bunu kavrayışımızı ve aktarışımızı derinden etkilediği bir nokta var. Onun için aslında biz her ne kadar bu hakikati açığa çıkarma yolunda yeni yöntemler üzerine düşünmeliyiz ve kafa yormalıyız. Bunlar kesinlikle gerekli. Ama bu mücadeleler ve onun sonucunda ortaya çıkan öznellikler olmasaydı belki yetersiz kalacaktı biz hangi yöntemi denersek deneyelim. Bir yandan da bu çalışma da aslında kadınların devam eden mücadelesine bir katkı olur diye umuyoruz. Teşekkür ederim. Sağ olun.
The next speaker is Susan Meiselas. She is a photographer and a distinguished scholar working on human rights violations. Presently, she serves as the president of Magnum Foundation. She's the author of 3 books, one of which is entitled Kurdistan in the Shadow of History. And I have actually an anecdote about this book. It was forbidden in Turkey, and I remember myself carrying 2 copies of book in my bag from New York to Istanbul. They are really heavy books, big. Okay, my Susan, the floor is here.
So in a 10-minute whirlwind tour, I wanted to try to identify stages of a process, because I think perhaps differently, it's the journey that interests me of where the ideas that hopefully inspire others in their own path. And I was thinking that there are stages of a process that you'll see in this set of photographs. One that begins with the notion of discovery, documentation, gathering, creating form that is 2-dimensional in book or exhibition, 3-dimensional cyberspace of website, and then the notion of return. So in a very short time, I want to give you an arch of that process. It does begin with a place I don't know anything about, and being an American, coming to Turkey would have been logical, as most media did. I went to Iran. I went to Iran and traveled in on the roads that the Kurds had just fled from. This is 1991. 180,000 Kurds had fled. The important thing I wanted to say is that I think there's a whole notion to discuss about how one's own body is an archive, and that you carry it forward with what you have lived in the past. So I would never have made this journey had I not been in Central America and other parts of Latin America, propelled to find out about the Anfal campaign in 88-89 under Saddam. So at this point, Saddam's troops have retreated. It becomes a no-fly zone in the area of northern Iraq. And this is one of nearly 4,000 villages that had been eradicated. The process of documentation begins with what can you find, what's the visible evidence, exhumation of graves, bones that reveal histories, the size of a bullet hole in the back of a skull, the markings of a grave site. Then, of course, for me, coming as an active photographer, is where's the audience? And the first audience, the logical audience for me, was the media, the public media, wherever it could be. Though it was quite after the actual events of the time. And likewise, a Human Rights Watch began a more investigative work, which ultimately led to the trial that you all would know against Saddam. This was the early documentation. The other side of the discovery was this sense that, much like the Saturday mothers and the mothers of the Plaza de Mayo that I had seen in Argentina, women were carrying and holding the images of those who had disappeared, which led me to think about whether or not one could create a visual history. I saw myself as an outsider, as an image maker in a history of image makers, and what I went to begin was to find where they had taken those images away from Kurdistan at this time. The records, the markings of relationships, which are very key. So this is the album of the woman on the left. Oops, I know I can point to it, but I don't know how to do it. Right there. On the left, Lynette Sohn, the wife of the colonial administrator at the time. She's 19 years old, and she's sitting next to the most powerful women in Mesopotamia, Adela Khanum, at that time. Her family album, buried in her own home, her attic. Counter to Western archives, where other kinds of burials take place because they don't seem to have present urgency. This is the RAF, the Royal Air Force, British archives, where, of course, they documented themselves as they bombed the Kurds in the 20s. And the pamphlet that you see on, this is a double spread from the book, it was collected in Sulaymaniyah. So the multiple perspectives from various sources became a kind of a profile of how to do this work, or to create a network of scholars who would identify individuals. The photograph in a scholarly book was not of great interest, except to say there was an event, they made this photograph, but no one knew what the event had been and recorded. So it was dissecting images. It was repatriating images, bringing what I had found in Western archives back to the community, and their unfolding and opening up their family albums. A process of reproduction, for a photographer always an ambivalent act. But the stories that then unfolded around these images as they saw what they were sharing. So the notion of a collective archive, each having a piece of a puzzle that they can contribute. Of course, never do you find all the pieces. The community that's created by a studio photographer, a local photographer. The stories that live around photographs that are not embedded in them, but they are remembered by those who hold those images. So in this case, it's in Kazakhstan, where a Kurdish family had moved from the border of Turkey and Armenia, been dislocated under Stalin, and the remembrance of who each of the members of that family had become. The public records, where we were when we saw this image, and what happened to the mother of those sons, a different memory for each of us who saw it, you know, something that Lori Novak's dealing with, this notion of aftermath. I remember exactly seeing this image years and years before, not registering that it was the Kurds who were killed, but thinking, would I have made that image? How was that image ever made, and how did it escape Iran in 1979 under Khomeini? Or the families that have buried photographs to protect out of fear under Saddam. So stories that inform us about how difficult it is to save. 18 tons of documents pulled out by the US forces from northern Iraq. Embedded within, there are multiple images that refer to from the Kurdish, from the interrogation of a Kurdish victim. A scrapbook is a very loose process, and yet it was the only one that seemed to make sense, to find documents, primary materials that lived around these photographs. And a book that really is not intended to be authoritative in any sense, but the beginning to piece together, kind of like a mosaic. You see it from afar, you can have an image of it, but up close, it's what's missing and continues to be missing. And that, what was missing, really propelled me into that next stage. One level, to reveal literally in the design, the layers that live underneath Fortunately, Quark had been developed. I mean, it's hard for any of you to remember, but InDesign, Quark, to be able to do this in your own studio and control the layering of information. So where things were found was missing in the story, and how they were found. And then letting those artifacts have another life outside of the emphasis in the book, moving it to an exhibition form, traveling to again pronounce themselves and perform themselves in a way for a new audience, and an interesting one because it principally was for the minority communities living in exile throughout Europe. So this was, in the Museum of Ethnography in Frankfurt, tremendously important for the Kurdish community living in Germany. Counter to its being in a public library or in other kinds of settings that were more like contemporary art settings. One other aspect I think is really important about this idea of the exhibition was a site-specific room where stories from exiles living in that community continue to bring their pictures to the museum. Unlike coming to the museum to see themselves, which was one dimension, it was to bring themselves and bring with themselves their past, and the museum at that time helped scan and record what they brought. That then became the motivation for AK Kurdistan to have a kind of simultaneity of a book which was a fixed object in contrast or parallel to an ongoing history of which one knows there's that much more that could be shared. And of course, I'm thinking of the stories I just heard as we all watch them. The stories go on, and this was an attempt to both locate the storytelling both geographically and in time. The important thing about the book, the website is also very primitive, 1.0. It's image and text combined. It had one dimension that I think was an early experiment. This is 1998, so the web is still very limited. There are no smartphones. You have to imagine there are no Google Maps. So these exchanges are very awkward. But we were interested in the notion of the unknown archive, people finding things and not knowing where to place them and what they were, parts of stories of other kinds. So how could we engage this knowledge sharing through the web, which we've seen many examples of since then. Important about books that may be fixed, but 10 years later, who would have imagined from 1997 to 2007, Saddam would be dead, the president of Iraq would be a Kurd, and it became urgent to address, there had been a major war since 2003, therefore, how do we bring together a new form for this book, a new chapter to contextualize it again, this history. It was both the narration, the narrative chapters are both translated in Turkish and Sorani, which was tremendously important in terms of bringing the book back to northern Iraq. So I am redocumenting Kaladiza, which I didn't show you the picture of, a town that had been destroyed with 70,000 people. Bringing back the book in the form of an exhibition in Kurdish so that people can experience. This is in the Red Prison of Sulanamiya. Now there's a cultural center in what had been the interrogation center under Saddam. And finally, here we are, and there's the wall. And I think that, you know, I'm interested in the ways in which these different audiences are reached by different platforms, why the story is never finished or complete. It's an opportunity for ongoing participation. Thank you.
Thank you, Susan. As Susan said, the stories go on, and I was just looking at her book, Kurdistan, yesterday, and the first pictures show Kurds crossing the border, Turkish border, fleeing from their homeland. The same pictures we see now. This is the stories really go on, unfortunately.
Well said.
The last speaker, Silvina der Meguerditchian. She's an artist, a granddaughter of Armenian immigrants to Argentina. Since 2010, she has worked as artistic director of Hashemetian, a project which reconstructs Ottoman Armenian town and village life. Her artistic work deals with the issues related to the burden of national identity, memory, the role of minorities in the society, and the potential of a space in between. Please. Yes.
Yes, today I will not speak. I will show a film of a project called Nereye, Where To, that took place, was a theater project, experimental theater project that took place in Fener Balat, the neighborhood Fener Balat and the Golden Horn. I am working on an art documentary of it, and I would like to show you an excerpt that takes exactly 10 minutes. So.
Adım Saadet Eroğlu. 94 yılında buraya gelin geldim.
Wait. No. We need a sound.
Adım Saadet Eroğlu. 94 yılında buraya gelin geldim. Çok mutlu günlerimiz geçmişti ve eşim akşamları işten gelirken komşularımıza dondurma alırdı ve şu mahallenin başından dağıtmaya başlardı. Burada Güler ablalar, burada Melek ablalar, burada Meryem Hanımlar, burada Madam Hanım otururlardı. Ve çok güzel günlerimiz geçerdi. Bu mahalle iyi günler vardı.
Ama ne yazık ki kendi evimizi biz bunlara satmak istediğimizde, alın bunu dediğimizde metrekaresini 1000 liradan alıyorlar. Şimdi burada bunun çok trajikomik bir şeydir bu. Bunun adı bir ranttır. Biz bunlarla mücadele ettik. Bunlarla mücadele ettiğimizde, mücadele ederken ben ve yönetim kurulu ve mahalleli olarak özellikle Evime Dokunma diye bir kampanya başlattık. Bu Evime Dokunma kampanyası Türkiye'de zaten ilk bizden duyuldu ve stadıma dokunma, okuluma dokunma, iş yerime dokunma diye böyle bir mücadeleye giriştik. Bu mücadelenin en büyük özelliği birlik olması. Mahallenin işe birlik ve düzenli bir şekilde görevlerimizi hepimiz yerine getirmemizden kaynaklandı. Daha sonra mücadelemizi bildiğiniz gibi davaların bütün hepsinde kazanmış olduk. Şimdi burada dediğimiz gibi yenilemeye karşı kesinlikle değiliz. Yenileme olsun ama mülk sahipleri yeniden edilmeden Avrupa Birliği fonlarıyla UNESCO'nun desteklediği şekilde yapılmasını istiyoruz. Bu olaylar bittikten sonra da zaten biz de mahallemizi nasıl güzelleştirebiliriz, nasıl bir şeyler katkımız olabilir diye kafe açmaya düşündük.
Yes, Biz yeni vakıf olarak, yönetim olarak 2 yıl evvel resmi olarak da okulu kapattık. Ben pek inanmıyordum izin verileceklerini ama verildi. Bir okulu kapatmak hiç de şey değil yani, güzel bir şey değil. Hele okuduğum ama açık olsaydı hiçbir şey yani hiçbir şey yaramayacaktı. Mesela şimdi gördüğünüz gibi Bayan Lemos'un sergisi var. Açık okulda buna izin verilmez. Düşünüyoruz tabii iyi bir tadilat da görmeli okul. Pek maddi durumu çok iyi değil ama Allah büyüktür, o da olur. Bu bir ikinci sergi gelir, ne bileyim ben böyle kültüre hizmet verir. Belki bir seminer olur yarın öbür gün bu okulda. Genellikle şimdi kapatılan okullar kiraya veriliyor ya başka okullara ya da işte ne bileyim çeşitli amaçlar için kullanılıyor. Ben buna karşıyım. Yani büyük bir kira alalım, şey edelim. Rum cemaatine hizmet versin ve onun dışında da kültüre, eğitime, öğretime biraz o artık hizmet versin.
Bu gördüğünüz bir yerin, eski sinagogdu burası. Daha doğrusu burası dini mahkemeydi. Bunu da size göstereyim. Bu anda kapalıdır ama çok değerli bir yapıdır bu. Ve ilk olarak dini mahkeme olarak kullanıldı burası. Beni takip edin, bir şeyler de anlatmak istiyorum. Takip edin beni.
Tabii.
Burası Balat'ın meşhur Balat Milli Sineması'ydı. Bu bizim gençliğin eğlence yeriydi. Bilhassa tatil günlerinde buraya gelir film seyrederdik ve o günler burada 3 film oynardı. Öğlen girerdik, akşam çıkardık. Hatta ben buraya sandviçlerle gelirdik. Ve Allah rahmet eylesin, herhalde ölmüştür. Bize yer gösteren bir hanım vardı. Ona da biz böyle bazen fazla bahşiş verip bize kız arkadaşlarımızın yanında otursun diye bir hediyeler verirdik. Burası da bizim için büyük bir hatıraydı.
Maalesef Fener'de doğdum, Fener'de büyüdüm. Ama bugün Fener'e gittiğimde beni tanıyan yok. Ben Fener'i tanımıyorum. Fener beni, yabancılaştık. Çünkü çehre değişti. Kültürler değişti, çok farklı oldu. Bir gün SSK defteri çıkar. O zaman SSK defterleri vardı, işte ilaç yazılır vesaire. Bitmişti. Çıkarmaya gittim un kapanına. Baktı adam, dedi ki amca dedi ne zaman Türk vatandaşı oldun dedi. Şimdi ben de espritüel bir cevap verdim ona. Dedim ki bak hesap et. 84 yıldır dedim Türkiye Cumhuriyeti vatandaşıyım. Ondan önce 700 yıl kadar Osmanlı vatandaşıydım dedim. Ondan önce 250 yıl kadar Selçuklu vatandaşıydım dedim. Daha önce de kaç bin sene olduğunu artık hatırlamadığım, bilmediğim Ermenistan Krallığı vatandaşıyım dedim. Adam anlamadı, baktı. Tamam dedim, sen işi yap ki defteri alayım gideyim. İşte maalesef durum böyle. Ama ben değişeceğine inanıyorum. Herkes birbirini tanıyacak, saygı gösterecek. İşte o zaman mutlu bir Türkiye olacak.
Thank you, Silvina. Great documentation. We have listened for women scholars and how they are engaged deeply in their collection of alternative archives, in using diverse methodologies and means, as well as diverse ways of presenting their work. Maybe one thing I would say before opening the floor to discussion, I think what connects them is the topics that they have chosen. They have given voice to people and facts that are usually ignored or made invisible by official archives. This is remarkable. Thank you all. I am opening the floor to your comments and contributions. I think we have 30-35 minutes. Maybe you first start, and then for wrapping up, we may have several minutes for the presenters. Okay. Yes.
This is a question for Leyla. Your account of the results you found from your report was truncated because of time. Could you say a bit more about how those Kurdish and Turkish oral histories differed?
Perhaps connected. Is it working? Okay. Could you talk a little bit more about the idea of non-encounter? Because I'm wondering, are these like physical non-encounters, or are they encounters in which there's misrecognition, displacement, or these kind of issues, perhaps?
This is really a question that applies to all of you. In sense that this is the theme of this panel is alternative archives, and you've all been presented alternative archives. I wonder if you share some kind of desire for these alternative archives actually to be accepted as the dominant archive, in a sense incorporated into what we call the dominant archive, or do you see a function in being the alternative archive?
Okay, I was so mesmerized by the film that I find it difficult to begin asking questions. But who was the person who did the music? I couldn't locate it, and it was very moving. I would like to find that out. And also, I think of Fener and Balat as a place where Jewish community lived. Were there no examples of their losses and memories and other people from Jewish people? And I also have a question for Leyla. I think your finding is a very important one, and perhaps root of the Kurdish problem in Turkey. I was curious about the cleavages. I mean, no encounter, is, of course, what you perhaps is the more parsimonious result. But I mean, are there cleavages? I would expect there would be some Turks who have touched the Kurds, and some others who have been touched, not to touch, and among the Kurds as well as among the Turks. Sorry. So I would expect some variation. Did you see any cleavages because of experience, age, religion, whatnot? Dads in military, fathers in journalists, and things like that. I was curious about that.
Could I have a few words from some of the speakers, at least, on this stereotypical association of archives and memories with women? And how would you complicate this a little bit more based on your own archival processes? And in what sense are gender enters into this process?
My question is related to one of the previous questions. I think it is directed to Susan, but anyone else can comment on it. I want to ask specifically about photography as a static image. And what do you think happens? Obviously, this is a huge question, but maybe you can comment on it a little bit. What happens when this alternative archive becomes part of the mainstream archive and news coverage? You showed some images of New York Times and Time and so on. You know that many studies show how the selection process of photographs for some news is actually extremely politicized, and it's not a coincidence that some of these images are selected for some news coverage. So what do you think happens, or if anything happens, to these alternative archives when they become part of the mainstream archive and become circulated within that context? Thank you.
That was enough for a while?
Yeah.
Okay. Then we go for a second round. Okay. Can you start, Leyla?
Okay, thanks. Yeah, about how the narratives differ. From the very beginning of our project, we involved the young people, even while we were conceptualizing what we were trying to do. And from that very beginning point, they reacted completely differently. That is, the young people who had been born and raised in Turkey's Kurdistan and who had been born into the war immediately got it in terms of what we were after. And so in that sense, we began to see them as themselves oral historians, because they already were involved in a struggle to voice their narratives in relationship to not only their own childhood experiences in the war, but also the experiences of their elder brothers and sisters. So for them, they felt that the most important part of their life had been already over, even though they were mostly in their 20s. So in that sense, the concept of what it means to be a child, what it means to be young, was very different. So their relationship with time was very different. For them, it was actually past the most important time, and it was based on that collective history of the Kurds and the suffering of the Kurds that they told their stories. And they told almost the same story. Even their anecdotes were almost uncannily similar. So this was something very fascinating for us. On the other hand, for the young people that we talked to in the western part of Turkey, even though they may, some of them, see themselves as nationalists, Turkish nationalists, in terms of their personal experience, they were much more rooted in the everyday local life. And they said, if you're interested in history, you should go to the older people. This is not something that interests us. So they had a very, very different relationship to time. They considered themselves at the beginning of their life. This is sort of part of it. As for encounters, there were physical encounters because, of course, many Kurdish people live in Western Turkey. But the physical encounters doesn't mean that there is not a non-encounter. My argument is that because of this different relationship to time, that there is a non-encounter. That's why people are unable to relate to one another. That's what we call non-encounter. Now, on the other hand, of course, well, there is also a difference in that Kurdish people know much more about all of Turkey because of migration, forced or economic, while for the Turkish young people, it's much rarer for them to go to Kurdistan. So it's only those, for example, who have even military experience, sometimes was more positive than no experience. Or growing up in a family of a bureaucrat who had to go and live in Kurdistan. Or sometimes friendships in universities or love relationships. Love is one, and marriage is actually one of the few encounters that we found very important, as well as, of course, civil society organizations. People who were involved in civil society, non-NGO organizations. In that sense, they had a more equal encounter. So that's about the encounters. I guess I should stop there.
Okay.
Yeah?
Thank you.
Susan.
Yeah, no, whose question, but I was thinking one thing we each have in common is that we're going to people who may or may not have told their stories before. And I wonder, in your case, if that's part of that different response you get, and also, I mean, I would think for Silvani, that has that story been told, and who are they telling the story to is so terribly important, who they believe is listening. So I wonder if, how well people, and I know in my own process, I didn't myself know what I was making. So maybe differently than the two of you who were working on a documentation process where you had a concept that you were filling the parts to in a way. And I was trying to create a narrative and I had no idea where it was going to go. It was determined by the people who contributed in a certain way. So do you know what I'm saying in terms of what the expected part of the storytelling is, who they believe is listening and for what purpose, where, did the women you spoke to imagine upstairs that they'd be in a room in Depo with strangers listening to their story? How do you inform them in the process is a question I would have for all of you too. Anyway, it's hard to be fluid about this.
I can answer. Of course, I'm not sure if this is an answer of them. Yeah, probably still they are not imagining themselves being in a documentary like this in Depo, but we were trying to inform them about the ways that this interviews might be used of. But of course, we did not have have it in mind to have such a video before while we were going to interview them. Yeah, while we were collecting. But we gave quite importance to take their consent on any kind of usage of the information, because that's their information at the end, that's their life, and they have the power on it, and they should decide how and to which extent we can use it. And but I would like them, of course, to have the chance to see it. But for example, we did not interview too much in Istanbul for this study, but we tried to use the ones that the parts from the interviews that we did in Istanbul, especially in this video, because they might at least have the chance to see what they tell us, as a part of such an video exhibit.
Yeah, I just want to say that in our interviews, it was very clear to us that the interviews were speaking not to us, but to the microphone. That is, they were performing very clearly, so that, and they articulated this, that they were speaking to a public that was not interested in them. And so that we knew also that in our personal relationship with them, which continues away from the microphone, there are many other narratives, many other stories, but they don't necessarily think them of value, of public value. So there are many sides to these individuals that we know, but it's the collective story that they choose to tell in their personal public narratives.
Silvina?
In our case, because it was an experimental theater piece, in fact, the people spoke to people. We interviewed them, and we intervened with a kind of dramaturgy for the theater piece. We had all the stories beside the other, and we choose the order and how to knit, like knitting, like all these stories. And then we gave them back their text, what they told to us, but in this order, and picking up the items or the moments that for us were striking. And in fact, like for 15 or 20 minutes, every person, and they were speaking in these special settings, and the people of the theater would come and would walk from one place to the other, so the play took more or less almost 2 hours, and it has so this ephemeral character, this theater play. It was for me really such a pleasure to spend time with those people, and we didn't have we were not in a festival, but both days, around 60 people came. We wanted to do like little intimate, but there was a lot of interest to see the theater play. And so myself, I wanted to add something with the film. I am on it. As you see, it's like 10 minutes. It will take like 60 minutes. It will be like a documentary. And I use the rehearsal time also to record them, and of course, I wanted that their bilinguality also is in front, so I interviewed them, I recorded them in Armenian and in Sephardi, Spanish, and Greek, so that in the film they will speak both Turkish and the other languages. Yes, and concerning the music, in fact, is one French musician called Louis Clavy, and another Belgian musician called Didier Laloy, and a lullaby, a Greek lullaby from is a historic recording I had in the film. Yes.
Okay, let's start for another round. Yeah, please. And then I should get...
People are whispering here,
If your question is
though.
not answered, you can just repeat it. Okay, so...
there's whispering around here that says you didn't answer the question about whether the alternative should remain
repeat your questions.
mainstream. But I have a related question, which has to do with the staging of archives that we've seen in these projects. Staging them on a website, and the design of the website is so important. Staging the archive in an exhibition that takes up space in a room like this, or staging it on the website or in a book, staging it as a theater piece or a film, right? So the film upstairs where the individual stories are cut, and we have a really gripping narrative that emerges as a collective story in the Truth, Memory, Justice project. I'm wondering how the mediation then enables you all to make these stories public in a way that they will be heard. So that seems to me to have maybe a different kind of way of taking the alternative and also creating an alternative media through which to disseminate memory and archives, rather than in a repository, which would be the traditional way. So I wondered whether we could think about that together.
Ayşe.
Had the exact same question. Maybe I will add two minor questions to that. We have the privilege of being surrounded by some of these archival projects being staged in different forms. The Memory Center videos upstairs, the Kurdistan project here, and in fact here we have Silvina's other archival, an art form that's coming out of another archival project, the Hushamadyan project, with photographs of Armenian families from all over Anatolia, sewn together by women in the form of two rags, here stitched together. So I would love to hear, following up on Mariana's question, also your reflections on each other's archival stagings or presentations in this exhibit as well. And I was also wondering if Şemsa could say a few words about DISA, a think tank based in Diyarbakır that's also involved in an alternative archival project. So especially in addition to the Truth Center and to Susan's projects, what else is DISA adding to the history of the recent war and to Leyla's, of course, to the experience of the Kurds, especially in Turkey? And I wanted to also remind us that the gender question is also hanging.
Okay. There was a question over there. No, please do. Okay. There was a hand, another hand here.
I think it's getting very hard to remember how to respond with the differences we have and points of commonality to some of these questions. I mean, yes, there's a mediation, both in the collecting and the expressions that you've seen. And I think you're speaking to, that wasn't the original intention of the documentation in one case, and in another case is a highly articulated, coherent form of a linear form, in fact. And I would say we are dealing more with interactive forms in the sense that one enters your website, chooses who to engage with on a grid. And in my case, be it with the book, it's not a book you sit on your lap and read in bed. It's a book that you open and close. It is not intended to have that continuity. It's intended to have that fractured feeling and different depths of storytelling in the midst of. So it invites a different kind of engagement from an author. So that's the first differential, I would say, in the principal platforms we're choosing. But I think when you get to issues of design, and I emphasize that because I was astutely aware that I was on this cusp of a digital age, and many of you in the audience would not understand that, but to be able in 1992 to control your own media, which in an indirect way speaks to the woman who asked the question there about one thing is to disperse your work through the media and hope for the best or try to condition it as best you can. Something else is creating homes for your own production, and that's so that image I show of the New York Times is because, yes, it was important that the Karemi massacre was identified by the cover of the New York Times. It had one power field in such a way. When it's brought back into my book, I'm speaking as from another voice and telling the stories of the villagers. So the stories that they don't tell, in fact, at the New York Times, because they're not at the side of the exhumation. So we can create our own forms for the materials we gather and continue to transform them, and I think that sort of speaks, and I'll end with this, is that some of the books, if you've read them, are directly compressed from the stories we gathered for the book to ignite the invitation to people to contribute to AK Kurdistan, and that led to stories we never would have imagined people sharing. And they were very often, unlike the political collective history that people feel obliged to tell if you don't know it, is the more quirky and unusual stories, and from storytellers who you might not have spoken to. I mean, the most striking one for me was Colonel Nab, who is based in Dahuk, who was pained by the whole experience of being located on the border of Turkey and northern Iraq for a period of time, and tells his story, which he would not have been the first person I would have gone to for a story, right? So he sends that story via the web. So I think where the listeners and where the audience is that we're in a new world, of course, since that period of the early 90s.
I just want to add a little bit to the mediation process. In our project, before we started out, we brought some young people together and asked them what they thought we should do, I mean, how we should go about it. And from the very beginning, they had a fight with one another. And the Kurdish young people basically said, why should we be in the same project? With these people, I mean, what do we have in common except having the same chronological age? I mean, they didn't even think that being young was similar for these two groups, for example. That was very interesting. But in addition to consulting with the young people themselves, we brought together a group of artists, designers, and people involved in image making, videographers, filmmakers. So actually, I mean, as academics, writing texts, we felt this sort of project was beyond our skills. So we actually asked such professionals to work with us. So, for example, our designer created a website which was not linear, which has certain themes embedded in it, and it's color-coded, so you can actually get lost in it. And some people have been frustrated, saying, like, what's going on? I click something and I go there. It's not, like, really clear what's going on. And that was the point. The idea was to sort of create a process of discovery without giving ready answers, as it were. And the colors kind of to attract, to make it accessible. So that was our designers' choices. The other thing about the performance and the sort of ready narratives is that, in a way, for us, the way to balance that was to do kind of an open-ended ethnography, so that we continue to build our relationships with our interviewees, not necessarily through constant recording, but through constant encounters and visits and revisits. So actually, I don't consider the project to be finished. So I am now, soon I'll go back to Diyarbakir to see the people. Because these people, are young, their lives are continuing, and the story isn't over. So I'm obsessed with following with their lives, apart from what we did in a particular room with a microphone. And of course, all the alternative performances will be part also of, what I write.
Yeah. Maybe concerning Hushamadian, in fact, being the case that I am an artist and I'm doing the visual language of the homepage, this was a conscious choice of the historian, Dr. Meguerditchian, that invited me to do, so that I can work with these notions of invisibility, absence, and so on, that were also in my artistic practice. So I think this is something, very important. I don't know if I understood well the question because of this alternative. Myself, I am an artist, and I don't need the flag, I am an alternative. I would rather be very happy to be here in Turkey, and that the schools here in Turkey use my archive to teach their children. So, in that sense.
You answered.
Also, I also want to say something about this presentation of what we, did here, this video, while we were first thinking about how we can use our videos and present in, interviews in this Women Mobilizing Memory exhibit. Of course, the first thing that came to our mind was just doing short videos out of some interviews, because as we also did not have that much of this artistic means, we couldn't imagine. And as we are also documenting about these enforced disappearances, it was always important to give the insights about the disappearance, the disappeared one, and individualize also that information. But then, we decided to keep that part anonymous. We don't learn, for example, from that video who the disappeared ones were. And we don't understand their stories of disappearances. As we decided to give primacy to the story, to the experiences of women, we kept the disappeared one kind of anonymous, but tried to give insights of the experiences of individual women. And this three-side video also gave us this chance of telling one single kind of story by using many distinct stories of and lives of many women. I would comment on one more thing, but I forgot. Thank you.
I just think one thing for all of us that's very delicate in this practice is creating the conditions in which people share and feel comfortable with you, with whatever you can express of what it is you envision. And at the same time, what they give you is what you're dependent upon to make whatever you do. So there's this interactive process in which, I guess at the end, you only can wonder, do they feel they recognize themselves in the work, whatever the form, Marianne, might be, do they recognize themselves? And they are those who keep us honest, in a sense. But that's a very delicate process of who shapes the work, if you see what I mean. Yeah? Yeah.
Very few words on DISA, as Ayşegül wanted to. DISA is a research institute located in Diyarbakir. We actually work on mainly two subjects, mother tongue, Kurdish, and a new publication also on paramilitary groups, village guards, korucular. What is interesting maybe with, for example, the korucu research is usually those kind of research or interviews are conducted by the victims. What we did, we went to the korucus, village guards, and tried to understand what their truth is, try to understand from their perspective. Actually, we have a website, disa.org, DISA. All actually projects have websites, so I really encourage you to Google and find their websites. We also, in DISA, we made research on mother tongue. Another new publication is on how the language is transferred through generations, different languages in the same home. Aynı evde farklı diller. I mean, again, if you go to the website, you can find the language. The publications are published in 3 different languages: Turkish, English, and Kurdish. So, I will say the story is not over, okay? But there's coffee downstairs, and the next section will convene at 3 p.m. here.